Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm Paul Pangaro. I'm current president of the American Society for Cybernetics, who hosts these events. Welcome. We appreciate you coming. If you'd like to learn more about the Society, we'll offer you a link in the chat at some point, and feel free to get in touch. But today we are focusing on our speaker today, and to introduce our speaker, I will introduce our host, Fred Steyer. Fred?
Yeah, thanks, Paul, and welcome everyone. And it's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Domini Pereira, who's coming to us from the Bauhaus University in Weimar in Germany. Domini brings a fantastic background in cybernetics and design, and actually recently hosted a number of sessions at the Relating Systems Thinking to Design conference in Brighton that was also online, that made very clear connection between Gregory Bateson's ideas of stories and design, and stories both in terms of stories that designers tell about themselves that are at the heart of design, and also stories that emerge with the interaction of people who design with others. Domini has also been working in areas of play and the transcontextual, and is giving us a wonderful presentation today on frictions and fictions. One other thing is what I would like you to do is, we're not a huge group today, but let's be present with Domini and be somewhat judicious in the use of the chat, which I know is very engaging, particularly because a lot of Domini's area is also in design and technology, and how new technologies shape design conversations. Domini, I look forward to what you're about to say.
Thank you so much, Fred, and thank you so much for the invitation for all of you for coming on this Sunday. And I think I would want to present some thoughts on how cybernetics design and fiction relate in complex ways around processes of technological change, and of course how particular runaway forms of this relationship are good at creating a promising future for some while taking away the future for other life forms. Now, this is not to say that this is in any way a new condition. This diagram of the runaway, this comes from Gregory Bateson, 1970. You find this in this book, The Compendium of Essays, Steps to an Ecology of Mind. On the right, I have also attached a different diagram, which is based on this first one. It's by Anthony Wilden, who around the same time kind of interviewed him and kind of discussed it further and present the diagram in a slightly different light, a more political, I would say, with a kind of political chart in it. But this is just like, a kind of a starter. But in the last couple of years, there is this kind of increasing interest in what is called the end times. And this keeps kind of it's a condition that's kind of generated by this ongoing knowledge that we are receiving, and that keeps building up on the planetary changes, the planetary thermodynamics, if you will, and many people questioning how is it possible to intervene within this runaway condition. Now, the questions around the changing nature of labor and work are one example of how people get into this notion of the runaway and to acceleration. But I will be using that to ground the discussion. But actually, at the background is a bigger question of addressing technological change and where design stands in relation to this. Now, what I'm also after is not only about questioning whether we have enough discussions about this at a theoretical level, which is I think happening, and what we're doing is also somewhat something like that, but also to suggest that there are perhaps other possible ways of relating to cybernetics, design, and fiction that will kind of, or making these things relate to each other, that can enable those who participate within these processes, like the everyday, the laborers or the everyday people who engage with these processes through their everyday practices, to kind of become aware of these questions and start to question their very relationship to these processes. So now, by placing these terms or notions on both sides of the problem and the ways of engaging the problem, I think it becomes part of a paradox, And exploring ways to navigate paradoxes has become central to my practice. And before wait until the kind of end of the presentation, at this point, I want to kind of loop back Fred, because I want to, I thought, the first meeting I had with Fred was back in, I think, 2019, when, I was getting more and more interested in the questions of practice, after, spending a couple of years in graduate school and discussing these things. And Fred kind of introduced me to Sweet Madness, and not the condition, but Sweet Madness, the book, which is actually one of the books written by the other William Fry, who was also part of Gregory Bateson's Palo Alto kind of research, where they had this, where they actually went into the question of paradoxes in detail. And what this book actually taught me at that point in time is to think about, regardless of the doom boom kind of, what it seems like, the situation, that paradoxes actually also could be navigated with hope. And but I'll come to that later. So my presentation today would have 3 parts. And in each part, I will introduce a particular notion of fiction. And then, of course, across these parts, you will find, let's say, different forms of fictions, which that would appear, which could, of course, fuel a conversation later on. Contemporary fears and hopes around digitalization, automation, and the changing nature of labor or work are bound to the growing power of cybernetic technologies. Now here, knowing that this is such a broad word, a definition for this would be to kind of consider this term as the extended forms of algorithmic operations apparent in the design of various forms of organizational systems, knowledge systems, service systems, etc. So these technologies also have an indivisible relationship to several problematic cultural fictions, such as modernity, growth, progress. Now, here I used another term, and in this context, the word cultural fiction relates to the broader cultural narratives that influence common sense categories of truth and norms that use. Yes.
Forgive me for interrupting. Should we be seeing something of text on the screen?
Not yet.
Forgive me. I beg your pardon.
That's okay. But these common sense categories then, of course, influence the way we make sense of technological change. And of course, the complex relationship between cultural fictions and technology can reinforce particular ideas about technology that can over time become hegemonic fictions. So to kind of, sorry, something happened. Okay, so moving on. To explain what I mean, I would revisit a previous ASC presentation, and this is and I was privileged to kind of listen to this in person. This was by Klaus Krippendorf, and he did this presentation. I think I've heard it twice, and it's important because it kind of also signifies a moment where we were looking at this question of criticality, I think also in the context of ASC. And so Krippendorf attributes current problems related to these hegemonic cybernetic technologies as emerging from a broader social history of uncritical cybernetics that rests on a misplaced belief in the universal applicability of mathematical conceptions of algorithms. And so cybernetic systems driven by self-learning algorithms, which are predicated on market-driven values of progress and economics, amplifies certain problematic institutional and cultural fictions. So this case of positive feedback, a good example is the use of algorithmic processes to automate bureaucratic processes, and which then, of course, help to achieve low-cost artificial control of populations. But nevertheless, we can see in empirical research how they validate, how these systems recursively repeat certain racial and gender biases. So I put this example, this book by Eubanks, Automating Inequality, which has this amazing empirical study about this. Now, these processes that Krippendorf maps out within his argument speak to emerging new socio-techno-environmental relations and related feedback at multiple levels, which is not reducible to changes in any one level of these systems, right? And the value of this whole argument, or the way he actually frames it, is that he's saying, just because they seem like out of control systems, it doesn't mean that we lose opportunities for critical engagement, and that we need to think about information beyond abstract terms and intervene in the very sites of action. Now, this is actually very admirable, and that's something that I think that one needs to follow up on. And then, of course, he has proposals for this, and it's based on reformulating what cybernetics could mean as an interdisciplinary language with social consequences that critically redirects consequences of these kind of uncritical cybernetic practices. But so now here's where I'm going to kind of twist this argument a bit. Now, his argument contains a very rich picture of how human agency and social agency might affect the design of these very systems, but it does little to kind of respond to the complexity of the ontological agency that these design systems, once they are designed, how they kind of influence an agency back on the human and the kind of social categories. So in other words, right, it's about how the increasing algorithmic power resets social norms and drives a sort of convergence towards a particular form of technologically mediated consensus that, of course, systemically minimizes human agency to deviate from these norms. So just to say that this kind of ontological agency of how these systems design back has a more than human and a more than social element that we have to take into account. And it is just beyond saying that some uncritical, an engineer who was not necessarily critically engaged in this, didn't really do that job properly. And it's just about kind of shifting that model, right? Because behind this idea is a kind of premise, if you will, of freedom and choice, on which what Krippendorf argues as accountable action is predicated. Now, my point is, when these systems keep designing back, there is something that happens to the question of freedom and choice that we cannot really understand unless you kind of resort to an ideal democratic model. And so we have to really understand how democracy itself has changed into some things in constructs like in the Western liberal democracy, the context of the markets, how it becomes a consumer democracy, etc. So I would like to explain how, like, possible alternative ways of expanding the way we then think about criticality and agency. And I think a key to kind of expanding this question is to think about the development of cybernetics beyond both its first order and the second order iterations to include a process of what I call cyberneticization that continues to this day. Now, this requires, even if it's verbal, a kind of a footnote, because what I'm trying to say is not that there's this idea of the first order and second order is in any way, it's a very important epistemic construct. It helps us order kind of in the progress of the field. You could use words like first wave, second wave, and there were a lot of developments of people who kind of intentionally associated with themselves in these kind of, orders and what they did. But this is just to say that there was a process that came about through certain systems that were designed that instantiated a kind of process and the kind of technical condition that goes far beyond the intentions of these people or what they were trying to do, etc. So actually what really helps understand this complexity is to frame this history of cybernetics not as one of technology, which is the usual path, but actually one of ecology, and not to think of the history only as of cybernetics as one of science, but that one of science that was then later appropriated in design to other fields, but rather actually from the very beginning co-evolving with something like a field like design. And this was actually my beginning in cybernetics and how I kind of started entering and framing cybernetic ideas. And a very good quote I still think about, and it's very useful to kind of introduce this to students, for an example, comes from Stuart Brand's book. Again, this is not published anymore. I think you don't find a lot of it, copies. but where he says, cybernetics has little to do with machines unless you consider or pursue that special condition. It has mostly to do with life and maintaining circuit. And again, interestingly enough, in these two cybernetic frontiers, one aspect is actually a lot about Bateson's work. Now, for anyone here who has probably, I think I need to kind of explain what I mean by this kind of first, second, and moving on to this process of cyberneticization. So I will kind of, for a beginner, say a few sentences. Cybernetics emerged as a field during the 1940s, investigating the complex nature of circular causality in feedback processes as systems learn and adapt. The earlier forms of this discussion, identified historically as the cybernetics of observed systems, focused extensively on order and equilibrium in systems that could be observed from the outside, so such as thermometers or even missiles. And here you see how order and equilibrium really start to play a big role if you think about design discussions. But again, I don't want to go in because this is like a story in itself. We can get back to this later. But then in the 1970s, these experiments had foregrounded the cybernetics of observing systems and shifted to look at how these circular processes operate in a more complex and reflexive manner across living systems that operate in far from equilibrium conditions. So these developments also indicate the shift from a first order cybernetic interest in adaptation, or what you would call adaptive behavior, to its second order interest, where the questions of non-adaptation and emergence were prioritized. Again, this is very interesting. When you map it across these artifacts, you see kind of different stories around this emerging. But so for an example, second order reformulations have influenced the development of self-learning algorithms, which are obviously open to contingency and which modify and co-evolve with the broader semiotic processes of meaning making across human and non-human systems. So what has happened is these processes, in some senses, have enabled technologies to become what is radically environmental. And this third kind of category I'm talking about, or this process, is marked by the radical environmental distribution of technological systems, ranging from the sensorial to algorithmic environments and from bio-nano to kind of planetary level technologies. Now, this becomes the process of cyberneticization, if you will, and the kind of radical environmentality of technologies become particularly pertinent to imagine changes around technology and work, where the technologies under consideration can no longer be imagined as an object in a factory environment, but in most instances, scaled towards something like a planetary infrastructure. So what this also does is, when you think about it in terms of the capital-labor relationships and how that's kind of theorized, for an example, Marx's idea of fixed capital, which is kind of theorized in the context of the industrial machine, is not sufficient to explore how fixed capital starts to take a double form, right, in this kind of digital machine. So it's capital, yes, for capitalists, but as soon as it kind of moves in a certain way out of the factory into the everyday environment, it has created this kind of psychosomatic relation with the workers and the laborers, and it starts kind of to futurally restructure the sense-making capacities, or incapacities for that matter, right? How modifying attention, memory, and kind of modifying how people make choices, enacting, etc. And this is this kind of process of ongoing ontogenesis. Again, a lot of theorists talk about this, but I think what's important for us is the kind of manifestations of these complex processes can never be clearly articulated within decision-making contexts, but it influences the way stakeholders in transition contexts envision and respond to kind of the changing conditions of their labor work relationships. So choices can no longer be addressed as choices made by single agents, but as choices that are already kind of technologically mediated, and it comes to this kind of technically contingent pathway. So this is just to say that the whole question of the politics of engagement in this context becomes much more complex. So the idea of, let's say, and this kind of sits on some of these ideas of, participation in a conversation, which means we cannot take the ability to, kind of freely act and participate as a kind of a readily available option. But, and it is necessary actually to include workers and general public in these debates, but gathering such a community is not to be seen as a solution, but actually as a problem. Again, if we go to empirical research, I mean, there's this like very interesting research done by those like Corinne Barth, where they look at, for example, feminist technology in design and computer science. So they try to see if you get a good kind of participation, a fair participation of different forms of, gendered, and you have this kind of conversation, does this actually mean that, what they create would have a different, would change the way we design things? But what they have found out is, as long as, these members contain certain kind of values or normative ideas about gender, then the whole thing that they're trying to address doesn't really become represented in the conversation. So you need, in other words, a second order of kind of setting up the very conditions for that conversation. And this is where I think the idea of decolonial theories such as Escobar is very interesting, because they say it is precisely the setting up of the conditions for autonomy and for changing the kind of norms from within that remains a challenge in the context of these accelerating technologies. And, so we can't take it as just a given, but as something that really needs to be further problematized. Now I move on to kind of the second part, which is to kind of talk about how this appears in the more political discussion. So you get the more kind of left-wing, right-wing discussions around it. This was like, again, for the last 5-6 years, you see a lot of literature on this, and you have the extreme left wing and the extreme right wing, all kind of talking about cybernetic technology idea of progress. But here they also kind of bring in the idea of speculating and speculative kind of modes of imagining futures. And what's good about these discussions is they do take the relation between technology and capitalism very seriously. And they talk about fictioning or forms of speculation as an active methodological tool. So this is my kind of second definition, if you will, of fiction, where the tool is a way of imagining possible futures. Now, there's another version of this that if there are designers amongst you, a lot of think tanks or speculative design, future foresight practices are using these techniques called design fictions, which most often in the kind of mainstreaming of these practices have ended up creating these kind of diegetic prototypes that are the kind of outcome of these design fictions, which often kind of, attempt to create a new consensus around a marketable technology that appear as a potential solution to our problems. So keeping that idea of fiction in mind, I think it's also interesting to see how the speculative imagination, if you will, and fiction appears in the more politics of the core politics of the left wing and the right wing. And it's interesting that the right wing example I'm taking is, or that is the most extreme form one finds in Nick Land. This is also a cybernetic cultures unit, right? This was at the University of Warwick, where there is this kind of extreme celebration of capitalism to kind of, as an attempt to bring capitalism to its kind of, extermination. And so there's this kind of celebration of unrestrained desires, and all these are like, there's a lot of quotes, etc. on this. Kind of, so cybernetics as a process is kind of like celebrated in this way as enabling unrestrained desire. And so Land and his associates draw methodologically on a particular type of fiction, which they identify as hyperstitions, that function causally to bring about their own realities. So hyperstitions are fictions, which they call, like, after they enter the cultural frame, strengthen the apocalyptic positive feedback loops that then exponentially accelerate social transformation. So in the design worlds, you can say, as design theorists, Douglas Spencer puts it, they become part of these kind of truth games constructed by neoliberal markets, where they try to create conditions of possibility that sustain the operation of the market. So, and that is preserved at all costs. Now, if you look at the new leftist interpretation, they do not frame the technologically driven futures of work as a kind of celebration of capital, but Cernicek and Williams are definitely inspired by this idea of speculation of the CCRU, and suggest that definitely machines and automation should be at the center of these ideas, and these speculations should drive towards better futures of work. And of course, the better here denotes a freedom from the current hegemony of neoliberal work models, and of course, their ideological infrastructure. So they argue for the possibilities of a counter-hegemonic project and a kind of a new common sense and counter-fictions. And what they also say that is that the people who are left behind in current processes then should become the participants of creating these counter-fictions. So these are the workers. So they should come together to form this kind of new counter-fiction or a new common sense. But the problem in this whole idea of participation is that they ignore that for this kind of project, that we first of all need workers who understand technology in a particular way, and also understand the role of design as something beyond something that some people would do, or beyond something like designing an object. So the limitations of the new left approach can be seen because they kind of try to boil down the broader questions of difference through a kind of universalism, a counterfiction, if you will. And it's interesting to put these side by side because it becomes like a Mobius strip, and to kind of see how, regardless of their differences, how there is a certain set of commonalities that come up. And it's also interesting for me in this context because not only to see how they address this idea of fiction and speculation in their political projects, but also to say that fictioning should become a important part of a future politics, if you will. So if you look at the commonalities, the first is, regardless of the differences of what they try to overcome, they both kind of visions kind of go for a monodirectional change, which means there's very little understanding of how technology at the moment also exists in difference, if you will, even the kind of global north-south distinction. Second, in both political agendas, there is an appeal to the imagination, right, which is completely disembodied in a way and doesn't really pay attention to the situated contexts of imagination. That imagination is primarily first embodied. And then the third is actually the way they categorize this we. And of course, they have very different we's on both sides, but there is definitely a we that is, there's an unproblematic kind of idea of a we who's working towards this meta narrative, but something that we already know is a problem in itself. So again, we come back to the question of possible alternative ways of thinking of then the participation of workers, right, or the general public. And what one sees is that the frictions that appear at the personal, social, economic, political, and of course, in between all these different levels, represent a kind of complexity of these extended techno-environmental systems. And of course, here I would use a very Batesonian term, which is transcontextual complexity. So the transcontextual complexity as a word here denotes that the complex ontological relationships between the more kind of material structures of politics and economy and the kind of abstract structures of thought formations, and how they kind of connect in these runaway contexts of cybernetic technologies. And my version of defining transcontextual complexity comes from the definition by Peter Harris Jones. And again, I think I should emphasize that because there are so many definitions around this term. So for those of you who are new to Bateson, although I believe most of you know him, I would like to again say a few sentences about him for a complete newcomer. So Gregory Bateson was an anthropologist and cybernetician who did not explicitly use the term second order cybernetics or second order to define his work. And if you look at this this graph of mine, where you see all these different people, Bateson is definitely in the background of these discussions. He's not directly presented here, but so he did, however, work a lot with these emerging ideas of second order cybernetics and recursive complexity, because it enabled him to frame living systems primarily in terms of communication and learning. And that was his interest in cybernetics, basically, where feedback made it possible to trace change in forms of pattern in the evolution and transformation of the living world. And I think the word evolution is to be highlighted here. And this is something that kind of sets him also apart from some of those other thinkers. And his work enables us to think about nature, culture, technology as a continuum rather than specific categories or binaries. And I would say there are three things that really signifies his work as important or different. One is obviously his interest in recursive ordering over linear ordering, and then comes multi-level pattern and his interest in multi-level pattern, and then his interest in semiosis over semantics. And again, this is something that sets him a little bit apart from the other constellation of thinkers that I have just kind of briefly showed before. So Bateson's work provide a particularly useful entry into engaging the more than human complexity of living systems, as opposed to, I would say, the better known humanist notions of second order reflexivity. Or to kind of put it in a different way, it enables us even to think about that humanist notion of second order reflexivity in a richer way. So it's like, how you use this third category, I guess. And of the frictions that emerge transcontextually across these kind of different levels, the personal, the social, the institutional, what happens is then they start to create contradictions between multiple logical levels. So in Bateson's discussion, these logical levels are like contexts. And what happens is then these could lead to a repetitive pattern or repetitive patterns that cannot be withdrawn from or fully articulated. So this condition in Batesonian vocabulary could be termed as a condition of a double bind or double binds. Now, here again, a little bit of background. The double bind concept is associated usually with, let's say, his work in psychotherapy, but Mary Catherine Bateson and others have pointed out how it could be more widely applicable within contexts of broader systemic relationships. So we can talk about these kind of broader processes. And in fact, if you look at the history of the Palo Alto group, this also became one of the kind of internal frictions, because at one point when Bateson and some others wanted to kind of expand the notion of it, and some others just only saw it, in the context of this kind of psychotherapy. So again, I think there's like some interesting literature on it, but one has to be very, I think, careful when one speaks about double binds to avoid instrumentalizing the notion of the double bind as a problem that can be solved by attending to, let's say, individuals or a specific entity by rational means. So double binds are not problems to be solved. Instead, they can be reformulated in ways that lead to a different understanding of the problem. And there are forms of practices that can enable such a process. And I think this is the most important part when it comes to the question of practice. And this is the last part we're going into, and just to kind of say a few words about this picture, which you would have seen. This is a totally different, experiment done again, I think in 2022, but it's an experiment in fictioning, but trying to kind of think about, how a story can invite another story. And the way the story was written is to also put, first of all, it's in 4 images, and it's about 800 words, so written in like a short story language. And it's also an experiment to see how, these kind of different systems of thought. So there's Bateson and the idea of pattern in here, and some of these ideas of decolonial theories I was working with at that moment, but also all superimposed in this landscape of elements of the crisis that was happening, which was very dear to my heart at that point in Sri Lanka. It's still always in crisis, but and kind of imposing these things and kind of superimposing these things to kind of come up with this idea of the fictioning. But that's a side note. I think this is where this kind of ends, and it ends with the proposition, is like keeping this idea of a second order in mind, as I have explained, in the context of Bateson's work. I have proposed an idea of second order design fictioning as a way of setting up a context that enables a presencing of these contradictions around these runaway systems, like so technology, market-driven design, design's own stories, value frameworks, and of course, the personal discomforts of people, so that they could become objects of contemplation. And the ambition also is to de-link certain methods of speculation, or this kind of dominant notion of design fiction, from its more market-driven associations, and kind of expose the insufficiency in the way that these associations address notions of technology and future. So I end up with some questions, and these questions, there are some questions that I have asked in the context of these projects, but also keep asking in the future. So when design fictions are focused on change, they prioritize disruptive innovation as an essential condition of progress and promotes disruption for the sake of progress. So disruption for disruption's sake. But can second order design fictioning, by shifting the focus to the change of change, right? For an example, by questioning how technological changes become embedded within contexts, assist the stakeholders to reframe their relation to change itself and to kind of change the value frameworks. And in so doing, can second order design fiction assist in dismantling the faulty notions of a technological universal? And can such a process of fictioning then enable to bring awareness of how technologies or techniques, if you will, differ from each other, not only functionally, but ontologically and moreover cosmologically? And knowing that participation and choice should not be taken for granted or even a given, can second order fictioning become an enabler for the second order conditions where different stakeholders, by being allowed to reframe the discomforts, the frictions, find out about their agency and choice, and find ways to kind of work towards autonomy? And there's some preliminary work that has been done in this context, and I've written about this in the context of two papers. So one is called Design Fictioning of a Second Order Kind, that actually has more discussions about the questions of work in the context of an educational experiment. Not 100% happy with it, but that was a kind of a starting point and a necessary starting point to think through these questions. Then there's a second paper, which is called Contra Innovation, that the first one's going to be published in the Enacting Cybernetics journal. Then there's a second one co-written with design theorist Tony Fry called Contra Innovation. It's actually about expanding the innovation imperative in the context of futuring, defuturing, and fictioning. And there we have actually a very interesting section on how to link these ideas of acceleration to the politics or concepts of growth and development, and especially talking about this also with cases and historical cases. So we've looked at the US, China, and also Cuba a little bit in that paper. And of course, this is in the future, and this is also an invitation. So I have the opportunity to kind of work on these questions in the format or within the kind of construct of a grant that we have received recently, and I think some of my colleagues are here as well. And we would like to explore some of these questions, and I would be doing that in the context of some workshops and global discussions. So if there's anyone here who's interested in these questions, thinking about these things, or have projects that that might relate to these ideas, so I would be very happy to hear from you, or even actually, if there is anyone here who thinks about these things and you end up with a sigh, like you're not knowing what to do, young scholars, I don't know. So this is definitely an invitation for all of you to join those kind of discussions as well. So thank you very much, I think, for listening. And let's see what Fred has to.
Yeah, thanks so much, Domini. There are a couple of excellent questions appearing in the chat, and I'd like to get to them. Something I hadn't mentioned at the beginning is our plan, which was an evolving plan, and I suppose also a design fiction in some ways, was that I would engage with you, Domini, around some questions that emerged from your talk, and then open it up to the larger audience. And what I'd like to do is to keep my questions actually quite brief, to open it up for others, because we have a very engaged audience here. Well, first of all, I'd also like to thank you for what was really a whirlwind tour of cybernetics, right? So I'm guessing there are many here who would love to have the slide deck from your presentation, because there were so many people central to cybernetics that you highlighted in very different ways in terms of how they intersected with each other, including, for example, Heinz von Förster and Gregory Bateson, right? But also others who weren't necessarily seen as central to cybernetics, and yet became, like Royston Landau, who became part of a group really looking at the intersection of architecture and design and cybernetics, and also the work of Arturo Escobar. And so that actually leads to one of my opening questions, which actually has two parts, and you can choose either one or look at the intersection of the two. One is that a lot of what you're talking about as you bring in political issues, in a very broad sense of political, to cybernetics and the design process, is the importance of, as we think about more participatory forms of design, how to design a process for design, right? And so it's not anything that we can get away from, but it also, and this is where Arturo Escobar's ideas of design for the pluriverse, which is so heavily rooted in Maturana's autopoiesis, right, becomes central, but also challenging traditional notions of participation, or at least opening up to question, what is it that we actually mean by participation? And what are the various levels of participation? And for me, the flip side of that, so speaking to that a little bit more of what is involved in the complexity of designing a process for design. And the flip side of that, which could also be the underside of it, is, since you mentioned William Fry's work early on and his Sweet Madness, the idea that you highlighted so well in design frictions and fictions, is the very notion of paradox, right, and double bind, and how we often see this as problematic, and yet at the same time, as we unconceal taken for granted assumptions at the heart of paradoxes, it also opens up possibilities for creativity, as you spoke about. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about both of those, or either, or say why those are bad questions. Right, so.
They are good questions, very broad though. I will try to answer them. So I guess, first of all, you said, why is it that we go through, I think, you kind of post this also through Escobar. And I think Escobar is interesting because in a way, Escobar talks about, as I said, there's this kind of dialect, wrong word again, complex relation between creation and destruction. You could for the lack of a proper word, dialectics. And the problem with this acceleration narrative is there's always too much of emphasis on what gets created, and there's less kind of interest on, the looking at the destruction. And I think this kind of viewpoint that comes from the trajectory of, Escobar, and which is kind of decolonial scholars, is they're actually very much concerned about that aspect that gets lost. And that is not to say that any of them is making an argument for an equally kind of, going back in time or creating this kind of equilibrium. So it's about a transformation, a dynamic kind of movement, but how do we kind of deal with that aspect that's getting lost? And then, of course, beyond, embedded in that question is also, I think, the way they start to kind of see how this process gets embedded or is always part of a technological story. And I think for them, cybernetics becomes just, one part of that narrative. If you will, and this people read in different ways. And what's also interesting in Escobar is he looks at cybernetics in a nuanced way. So I think as you mentioned, he draws from Maturana. I would say it's mostly Varela.
Yeah.
And so it's Varela's idea of autonomy, and Varela, in terms of how he talks about embodied ethical action, that really kind of for him becomes also one of these kind of ways of going into talking about participation. But having said that, I think what they do well is to kind of already problematize, how these things start to interrelate. So they don't take, cybernetics as a given, an answer, but to kind of critically, in a second order way, if you will, engage the negative or whatever has been the outcome, which has gone beyond some of the kind of original intentions of the people who are really, doing these experiments. And I think what that also shows is, on the other hand side, right, design as a category is also an extremely problematic thing, and different people understand design in different ways. They have different definitions. Often we understand design through these kind of institutional, etc., particular structures. And design and its agency, and again, in this whole school of thought, something that they also argue for is to say that design happens in places where they don't really talk about design, right? So design happens in the everyday. And it's not, again, for us kind of cyberneticians, it's like people who know the history. And this is something that I said we have to tread that in a nuanced manner. I see this, for an example, in the work of especially women who were cyberneticians, something people like Mary Catherine Bateson or Annetta Pedretti. And I think, at that point in time, we don't have a lot of recorded figures, but in the future, looking at, the current composition, we'll have many, where people were actually engaging their everyday questions, right? So for Mary Catherine Bateson, it was about designing, and it was about actually how did she respond to the transformations in her own life as she moved across contexts, right? And in changing jobs, how does she then kind of look at some of these cybernetics ideas in her everyday context? For Annetta Pedretti, it was always about, in that kind of getting into her house and kind of being engaged in this very particular moment in Spitalfields in London, where there was this huge debate about conservation, which is, how do we talk about feedback and dynamic transformation? So again, this is a different way of, I think, problematizing design, and it's a very important one. And it's something that we sometimes forget when we act as designers that work in particular institutions or kind of certain frameworks. So I think in that case, it becomes really important. Then, of course, you mentioned the paradox, right? And this is something I, of course, as I said, I don't have an answer to this, but this is also exactly the inside-outside nature of this question, because I don't think there is really an outside to this. And the conscious purpose, right? So I think in a way, this is where Bateson's work becomes, on the one hand, very interesting in terms of understanding the problem, but, what do we do then? Because he says, every time you move with conscious purpose, that we kind of, you're unable to kind of see these patterns of the whole. And that's why I, as a intentionally use this word practice, to say that perhaps there are practices that could kind of shift our relationship to look at the whole. And I don't know, as I said, it's just like there might be a lot of experiments going on there, but I think we need to at least, try to understand this. And well, what I get really from the double bind group, like the Palo Alto work, is actually the way, the humor, and that you could like kind of navigate paradoxes perhaps in a much more playful way, if you will. And that kind of the playful character brings something to it rather than trying to be like, extremely serious sometimes. So
Yeah,
just I'll leave it at that.
No, I encourage people to read William Fry's book also. Just as a quick follow-up, and then we can move to questions from others other than me. But just as a sort of taking off from what you're saying, particularly in the ways that you're bringing in Arturo Escobar's work, is the distinction that I think is at the heart of what you are presenting between, just as cybernetics has very often been misunderstood in terms of control of rather than control in a system, you're making a distinction between design of something rather than, or design for something rather than design with, and you're advocating a design with. And whether it's design with other humans, which can be intentional, or design with nature, and recognizing an ability that we need to have as designers to appreciate how nature talks back to us and allows our design to unfold. And it seems to me that a lot of your ideas of frictions and fictions juxtaposed also speak to this idea of really this sort of unconcealing of taken for granted in how we design with as a participatory process.
Yes, and I'm also like a strong believer of the absurd in a way. So I
Yes.
feel like, you know, I mean, sometimes you could talk about things like, how do you say, like how to deal with crazy sometimes. So there's like common sense, right? So there is like common sense ideas of, you know, we could think that we might be able to resolve something or kind of create consensus through conversations. But we know very well that, you know, our structures operate in a certain way that they're so absurd that sometimes there is no space for that. So you have to have other tactics. And again, so the humor and these kind of things are like these kind of subtle ways, strategies, if you will. And, you know, so that for me is also very interesting.
Yeah, well, thank you. Lots more to talk about. I do want to open up to other questions. We have a question from RMC, and I don't know who that is. Probably I should.
Sorry, that's just how I'm blocked in there. My name is Robert Cutler. And
Hi.
Okay, yeah, if you could ask your question, Rob, because I think it connects very, as you bring in
Sure.
Lacan, it connects very strongly with how Domini brought in Anthony Wilden's work earlier. But rather than me reading your question, why don't you just speak it?
Thanks. It's in the chat. Everyone can follow along. Do you find the categories of psychoanalytic social theory, not limited to the Frankfurt School, but also not excluding the Lacanians, plus other neo and post-Freudians, or even, for example, Bernard Stiegler, do you find the categories of psychoanalytic social theory to be of any use in theorizing the dynamics amongst the individual, different groups, and various systems, whether you are analyzing the actual situation or fictioning their potential future relations?
So
if you don't find them useful, that's okay too.
it's very useful, but I think I am a little bit hesitant in the sense because I don't know if I understand the Lacan. I mean, Jacques Lacan has, I have never like really studied him intensely. So I mean, I know Wilden.
That's okay. I just dropped him in there as a name check. I don't think much of him either.
I mean, so I mean, but when you go into the kind of Frankfurt School dialectics, I think there is something about, I think that has been the question, I think, in the recent years with people like, I guess, to again drop a name, Haraway and them, right? They've gone beyond this idea of the Frankfurt School dialectics to kind of say that it by itself doesn't, you know, this kind of the way that it resolves or how do you attend to the dialectic is not enough, and to kind of go beyond it. And I mean, Stiegler, I would put in a different category, right? I mean, so Frankfurt School nevertheless has a particular understanding of technology and culture, which I would say is still very much in this, you know, binary. They're not, and I mean, of course, again, we cannot boil down Frankfurt School, but you could go into like, let's say, the negation of negation, just like Adorno, is still could be questioned. And then there's, of course, the Frankfurt School, what they talk about in terms of aesthetization of politics, right? Now, one might think that really lands on a little bit of Bateson's politics. But again, I think there is like a subtle difference in terms of how Bateson sees his aesthetics, if you will. And you see this, so if the people who really kind of use Bateson, in R.D. Lang, for example, you might see a more bigger presence of the Frankfurt School kind of dialectics, right? But then Stiegler, I wouldn't really put in that category because for me, Stiegler comes from a different trajectory of technology, if you will, and a trajectory that tries to understand this, what you call the technical object, as something that's not fully constructed, right? But something that's as an evolving individual. This comes from Simondon. And this is also, I think, in the history of philosophy, this distinction between, you know, going through Heidegger or going through, you know, or what Simondon does to update Heidegger, if you will. And so to me, then Stiegler kind of speaks of categories in a very different way.
Yes.
And for me, I mean, I think this is all very nice and like, amazing theory, but that's what I kind of hinted at in the very beginning. It's starting to open up a lot of conversations, but still there is, I think, a lot. And of course, what it does is to kind of help us critically understand cybernetics, if you will, or the condition of cyberneticization, what that has done. But I also feel like, and this is me personally, I am a person who always thinks about, what does this mean in practice? So as far as I kind of use their understandings to think, for me, philosophy is also, it comes with a simple P. And, that's why I am very much interested in always thinking about a theory of practice. And that's why I kind of, in some senses, that's an appeal of cybernetics to me, if you will. Some people might call me kind of too scientistic, and I have been called that in this discussion around this. But I think there are like interesting, as I said, these kind of outliers in cybernetics, where, certain practices that don't really, that, does have a practice orientation, but still kind of enables us to think about theory in a particular way. So
I'll just one response.
do you want? Yeah, please.
Moderator will
Go ahead,
allow.
Rob. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I appreciate and agree with most everything I've heard you say about this. I agree with you that I'm interested to know, just as a brief follow-up question, after I finish my brief reply, what, if anything, in Stiegler you find particularly of interest and or use in your particular approach to those things that you approach in particular. I agree with you, of course, that he is in a different category from the Frankfurt School and all of that. I felt that having mentioned Lacan, who's a Frenchman, I felt that I had to mention also Bernhard Stiegler. And so the follow-up question is, yes, I think I already stated the follow-up question, didn't I? That what is it in Stiegler? Oh yes, to just to clarify that I agree with you with what you imply, what I heard you to imply, which was that Stiegler is in some ways, I'll go further than what you said, a one-sided interpretation of Simondon, and it's necessary to bring the whole other half, as it were, other than individuation from Simondon, in order to balance Stiegler's pessimism, for lack of a better term. And so that's my question about Stiegler to you. And I'll leave the Frankfurt School behind, as it's too deep a question to go into further in this brief. I want to thank you for your ideas, which I may use if you have a good question answer about Stiegler. I may ask to be in touch for permission to mention you as I'm been invited. I don't. My position is as a practitioner member of the Waterloo Institute of Complexity Innovation. I do international relations and epistemology of science and things like that. But I was asked to do a paper for an international Marcuse group, of all things, and so that's how I come back to this. And I'd like to stop there. So that
well, thanks so much, Robert. And what I'm going to do is to leave Domini's response to your second question open, so we can give a chance to some others, unless Domini has a very quick response, but it's not a question that lends itself to a quick response.
Yeah, I don't think so. But I mean, first, I'm also not, I would say, a Stiegler specialist, in the sense I don't know if I'm even in a position to kind of answer that in a, an authoritarian, with authority. But what I find, again, I'll tell you what, I really find interesting is Stieglerian interpretation of memory, for an example. And how he uses that in the context of the digital and techniques. And I think if you go along those lines, there's something to talk about in terms of, what these technical objects do in terms of, the artificial kind of memory, as opposed to how you kind of talk about, techniques as a kind of memory construction, etc. So that I think would be an interesting avenue worth exploring. But we
Thank you
could
for
go
that.
on. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that's emerging here is the bringing together of really ways of being in the world with practice, and thinking about what designers do and linking your ideas of friction and fiction juxtaposed for practice. We do have a question from Peter Tuddenham that has to do with, well, I'll let Peter ask the question. Right?
Thank
It's
you.
bringing it back to ourselves as a group in ASC. Peter?
Well, yes, thank you. And a wonderful tour de force, as you said, Fred. Thank you very much. A number of thoughts came to mind as you were talking. I'm always concerned that we don't address sort of some of the really pressing issues of our time. And you touched on some of them. I think they're about the responsibilities of engineers who are designing things without thinking about the people that are involved. And I very often think we don't think about the people enough. And so as someone that kicked off something that might be absurd called the Ministry of Fun for the American Society for Cybernetics as a sort of a working group to really tackle this issue of the absurd and how, and the fun part of it, I would hope that perhaps we could continue the conversation under that framework at least once. Look forward to that. My question is this, I feel there's some pressing issues in the world that are unprecedented. And that I think that people who are interested and know about cybernetics, call yourself cyberneticians, cyberneticists, or whatever, have a responsibility. And so my question is, how can we, as an American Society for Cybernetics, apply second order fictioning or design fictioning or fictioning, and frictioning, it sounds like a law firm, to ourselves as individuals and as a society of cybernetics, to co-explore our role and responsibility in the wider social, technological, and global societies with all the problems that we're facing today. And one that I've been focusing on the last 20 years is the problem of the ocean, which nobody knows about and is going acidic and heating up as just one instance. But the issues of algorithms, of mandates, forced vaccinations, things of that nature, freedom, as you mentioned the word several times. Anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah, Domini, I'm sure you have some thoughts about Peter's comment and
First of all,
suggestions for us. Yeah.
I would be very happy to, continue the conversation about the Ministry of Fun. That sounds really fun and sounds like a really interesting idea, which I was actually unaware of it, so would like to learn more. And when I think the nature of the question and the way you pose it, I think, and if I'm going to answer you, I think it's about, here's something that I think I can't answer for myself, I think, in the sense, if such a change is going to happen, I think this is, we need to, it's a kind of also, it needs a conversation. And I think it's happening in different ways, but then you came up at a very kind of another point, which is you spoke of these, like the issues that I also spoke to. But here I think is something very interesting. And this is something I think as the Society of Cybernetics, or all of us who call ourselves, I guess, in some senses, most of us are like transdisciplinary, right? We just don't feel really uncomfortable in one discipline. And I would say that one thing we also have to do is probably to see the patterns that connect these issues. So in other words, if others are kind of doing these, research on some of these specifics, I think there are patterns that connect it. And for me, I think that would be one big contribution that we could try to launch, if you will. So a conversation about a kind of a conversation that needs to happen. And I feel like most people do this in a limited manner. They say saying that someone is really interdisciplinary doing work or transdisciplinary work is very different from actually doing it. And then, of course, in doing it, what happens is also very different from, what one might expect. And in most of the moments that I've tried to engage this, actually, in terms of working with students or communities, there's this huge problem of language. And to me, that's another, I think, a launch point into these ideas of fun, humor, I mean, I have for the last 4 years been working on different ways of using this idea of meta communication, because for me, that's how I kind of understand it. Now, it sounds a little bit reductive when you say it like that, but how can we in different contexts, regardless of what we are working on, whether it's looking at, a sinking city, people feeling depressed, or kind of students trying to understand their own future of work, or, looking at a complex history of a building and how do we make it available, all these questions have, I think, things that connect them, and this is something I think we could really start to work on, and I think something that most of us here might have the kind of capacity to kind of, I'm not saying they can do it, but I'm saying they have the capacity to kind of launch or kind of prompt something like that. So I think that to me is interesting. And the question of freedom. I mean, you said that I said it a couple of times, but I think it crosses my mind, and it crosses my mind probably more than, it might for someone else, because I think this is why I say situated contexts. And sometimes if you think about the context that you come from, right, and think about like questions of freedom, there's a way in which like, this kind of standard idea of freedom as it would be kind of defined, in the kind of autonomy of even in Heinz von Forester, and here I'm being a little bit critical, and you can't, I mean, he was working in his milieu and one can understand that, but I think there needs to be a radical update of how we understand that. And I come from a country, as I said, Sri Lanka. We have a democracy, we have a representative kind of democracy, which is a huge failure. So, these kind of things really, it starts to bother you. It's at the back. I mean, you might not write about it, right? Might not be your topic, but they're always at the back of your head. And I think that's something, as cyberneticians perhaps can think about.
Thank you. Yes,
Yeah.
Conversation for the conversation.
Yeah,
Good.
Thanks, Peter, for a great question, and Dulmini for your response. And for me, it also evokes what I think is a wonderful, but sadly not referenced book enough, although I'm sure everyone here has read it, but Jeffrey Vickers' book, Freedom in a Rocking Boat, that encourages us to think about freedom quite differently with his appreciative systems. So yeah, Jude has 3 comments, and maybe Jude, I don't know, well, knowing you, they're probably all related, but if you can give one, and then Kille also has a point, and then we'll come back to you, or, yeah.
Yeah, they're all related.
Of
Let's
course.
hope.
Yeah,
Let's
go
hope
ahead.
people can see the relation, right?
Right.
Okay, so you bring up the issue. Thank you very much. Frictions, conflict, fictions, my desires, which aren't yet reality, but I would like them to be such. Just a quick comment. As you were speaking, I was trying to fit it into my epistemological way or lens for understanding. And I have 3 comments, and these are all, I think, related to your comment about language and generating a new language, which is something I think is fundamental to the process of generating this kind of social change. And the first one is that I think there's a major distinction between cybernetics and artificial intelligence. And I would suggest that in your beginning, you were talking about artificial intelligence, not what I know as cybernetics. Cybernetics has always been, for me, as beginning with the Wiener's book about, what's it called? The human use of human beings, or something like that. Someone help me with that.
That's
right?
correct. Yeah.
That brings up that issue. There's a history that Ernst gave about cybernetics where he talks about in the 70s, when there was this movement toward a second cybernetics that emerged through not Mary Catherine, but her mother, Margaret Mead's comments that triggered Heinz to do this idea of second cybernetics, what he called second order cybernetics. And that really had to do with the responsibility of self in the design of whatever you do, daily life, architecture or whatever. And that there were a group of people in cybernetics who said, no, I create things. I'm not responsible for what I create. And according to Ernst, they left and they became what is now known as artificial intelligence. So I think that there's a very, very important distinction in the language to distinguish between what I think is, and I'm not claiming this to be the truth, I'm claiming it to be my truth with a small t at the moment, that there's a very, very difference between what cybernetics as a social movement process versus artificial intelligence. Of course, many would say they've come around, but if you read today's New York Times article in the business section about robots, they ain't come that far, that's for sure. Secondly, I just want to make a quick comment about the term democracy. And I think democracy has not changed. It's been implicit and explicit at different levels because democracy, as we know it, has always been nested in capitalism. And that is a contradiction. And I think there's an important distinction between when is a contradiction and when is a conflict. And this has to do with what Fred was pointing out with the with and the in and the of earlier. Brune once said, conflict requires a change in the system. Contradiction requires a change of the system. And if we can embrace that in our designing our social transformations, I think it would make a world of difference. May I say just one other thing? And that's this whole idea of neo-Freudianism. I'm much more of I came to cybernetics as a consequence of looking for a healthy way of looking at human beings. And I found that in cybernetics in 1992 at the first ASC meeting I went to that Rodney Donaldson had organized around the cybernetics of Herbert Brune and Humberto Maturana. And it was at that meeting that I intuitively knew I had found a way of looking at thinking and being and doing that was nested in a healthy way of being. Freud didn't offer me that, ever. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank
I'd
you.
love to be hey, and
Sidekick back, and thank you very much for the comments. I mean, I take, I mean, there are like a lot of, I took down notes, very helpful. I mean, I'm also a little bit familiar with Brune, but I think I'd definitely like to look at, you know, how you really phrase that idea of democracy, contradiction, conflict, and that's like very interesting.
yeah,
But to go at, if I were to respond to some, one part of, I think what you were saying is, I think this idea of, you know, how do we understand cybernetics, I guess, or how does the society understand or kind of frame cybernetics? And this is the muddle, right, in a way. So there are like many stories, and the idea of me talking about the first and second orders, and in a way of talking about this process of, and I know for a fact that cybernetics is not AI, and the fact that, for an example, Paul has created New Macy, I think the genesis of this is also to kind of talk about this pandemic of AI, which is also, I think, you know, at the beginning of this criticality discussions that was there. So I'm really aware of that. But nevertheless, there is something about, I think, cybernetics, and that's why, again, we see this in design, is about, you know, there's one thing about how the proponents of these, I mean, there are also epistemic distinctions, first order and second order. It's a way when we look back, or even in those moments, people understand their own doings. So there is one way in which the people who were doing the things with, let's say, intentions, what their intentions were and what they were doing, then there's something that happens between, you know, how they think about what they think it is that they're doing and what actually happens when they're doing it, right? And then there is, I would say, a third category of, after having done that, you know, what does that thing that they designed actually then kind of create some of these after effects? And I think the problem is somewhere in this kind of model, you know, there were people kind of using certain terms and the kind of, you know, not drawing certain kinds of distinctions that have all kind of gone into a way in which like kind of people start to define or understand the word, I guess, cybernetics. And the problem is, I think, I mean, for you, Jude, I think it's really good because it's also how you're inducted into something, right? A field. And I think you have gotten some kind of, I would say, you know, a way of getting into the field where you have seen this social aspect thoroughly. But whereas if I'm to kind of, you know, ask a student to kind of look at this literature, and if you look at certain kinds of literatures and how this word comes up, so this is a very interesting way. Like let's say there's also an epistemic acceleration. So some ideas associated to cybernetics have reached, you know, a kind of a mainstream, right? And some ideas obviously not. And we need to, I think, deal with this head on. And again, I think this is not a problem that one can take as, you know, a given. And that's why I said, you know, even if you look at, and the moment one can start to really dismantle this is even if you take the story of something like the BCL project, and if you really go into the countless different amounts of, or like a different stories in that, and this is actually a history I have mapped. This was my kind of PhD project. It's a kind of a, to see that how everyone kind of uses one idea in a with a very different kind of charge, right? And
Right.
but the problem is people don't really, when you kind of understand this, they don't really see cybernetics in that way. So I think, if at all, I would repose this as a question. It's a question we need to ask ourselves. How do we then introduce something like this, such a complex topic? And one thing I do personally is to kind of lay bare these different distinctions. Now, I didn't have time to go through all of these, but I think in what I have done, I have shown like, a sufficient amount of frictions so that people will see that there is no one mainstream narrative for cybernetics, if you will. And I mean, there is no other kind of option to, I guess, to rather than engage in it head on. And yeah, I think it still remains an open question.
Well,
Thank
thanks,
you.
Domini. And so we have also a wonderful comment by Pille in the chat. And Pille, I wonder if you could speak the comment or perform it.
Sure, but I'd like to make another short comment first.
Okay.
And that is that Maturana spoke of freedom as the choosing your choosing. So it's a reflexive reflection, that being able to choose your choice, whatever you choose. And that is the experience of freedom. And I'm wondering if that will fit in. But then the other part of my reflection is kind of a stepping back and listening to how this presentation has had such an interesting weaving of a web of connections, that also at that one time there's the whole complexity of the and creating a coherent set along with the understanding of the people. And at the same time, there's the choosing specific words that have new openings and new connotations of meaning. I found that reflecting on the notion of fictions very helpful to think in terms of our responsibility, and in when we are planning or proposing or projecting or predicting anything, we always seem to think that we are creating a future towards that which we predict. But what we're doing, I think, when we realize it's fictioning, is we're imagining that such a future might be, and then acting in the present in a manner that's coherent with what we might desire in the future. That relates to what Jude was saying too, that the fictioning is about desires. But it leaves us in the present. We're not having to create, we don't actually have a future, as it's only a construct. Yet matters how we conceive of it. And the other half of this was this web. I recognize that we all have a web of coherent understandings that we weave together with many people's ideas. And how difficult it is when you're speaking to a group who have different webs. How do you refer to the particular connections you have created with the different names? For I couldn't follow some of the references you made because I hadn't read the people. They were new to me. And yet others I did follow, so I felt like I was creating a partial web, out of which I felt I had a picture of the whole without even seeing the whole. I was aware that there was a coherent web that would be fun to explore. And it takes a while in the conversation with anyone to develop the common connection, so that when you hint that so-and-so, a particular, there was some of these sociologists I didn't know, you know what that implies. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Pille. It's so good to hear from you, Domini. Yeah. Thoughts on Pille's
Thank
comment?
you so much.
I have some
mean,
myself, but go ahead. Yeah.
the web one, I find it very interesting. I mean, I think that's also in a way like we're talking about the limits of our own cognition in a way, right? And not only limits, but also how we kind of navigate things. And
Yes.
I think it's a very interesting comment that you made about the web. But again, when it comes to, I think, these complex pasts, if you will, and I think this is where something like we go to also the previous comment about, how do the mainstream kind of approach cybernetics. I think these webs are very important because the web has an ability to kind of pivot certain concepts or kind of give them a particular kind of charge and put them in a kind of a broader perspective. And it's important, I think, and something, one probably needs to get better at. I'm not good at it, but I try. But I was intrigued by the other one where you talked about, I think, fiction and desire and this kind of, I think that actually relates to time, right? And how causality, if you will, or how time or our inability to kind of, how do we deal with our own inability to deal with perceiving time as something that is a kind of a loop, in a Heideggerian sense, if you will, the kind of futural and the kind of past as something that's really connected, which gets lost in the clock time or our perception, the human perception of time, which is very limited. And I think you kind of nailed it when you say the idea of, I think, introducing fictioning is in a way to also generate that potential. And potential for many, on the one hand, that's been lost in a kind of certain idea of time, but also the futural potential in people. And I think fictioning is one of those practices that automatically sets that up in a way that if we do it in more practical, or you could say, certain kinds of forms of practices that they don't enable us to do that. So you can draw a lot of causal loop diagrams, for an example, and talk about a very simple, future, past, present connections. And you could do, you could engage in fictioning, and you'd immediately see the power of fictioning to kind of bring into that this modus of, what gets lost in our normal perception of time in a way. Yeah. Fred.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add to that. And just as we're nearing, since you mentioned time and we're nearing the end of our 90 minutes, one of the things that I really appreciate about your talk, Dilmini, as Pilla mentioned that you were bringing in authors that Pilla said she didn't know that well, is how you created a frame for us to appreciate what you're doing in a way of seeing connections among authors that clearly matter to you. And you're bringing forth the ways in which frictions and fictions and cybernetics come together. So in a way, for a lot of us, it becomes an invitation to explore who these other authors are. And at the same time, you're bringing together, for myself personally, people whose works I have read, but not as coming together in the way that you brought them together. So for example, imagining a conversation between Arturo Escobar, Norbert Wiener, and Christopher Alexander, right? Probably never had a beer together, right? But still imagining what would emerge from that. And I'm curious to know, as a final question, how you bring these ideas to your students in terms of thinking about frictions and fictions, really as seeing new opportunities for design and for building future worlds. So there's a huge question to wrap things up, right?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at some of the practical projects I've done, I think I've done it in different ways. I think that what runs behind all these is like fictioning for me, or actually to say it better, second order fictioning is for me another formulation of what I would call this, the idea of the Batesonian metacommunicational frame. It's a play frame, basically. It's like this idea of how do I set up a context so that how you bring about things that escape. So I've done this in different ways, and to kind of try to expand frictions. And, one is to kind of really work with the idea of play and humor, and I've done this in kind of Wicked Problems, Wicked Play. This was like a very interesting project where, you really start to think about how becoming playful and understanding frictions can enable them to look at, questions of sinking cities or whatnot. And in second order design fictioning, I mean, the experiments I've done, there's a lot of students, this was during COVID times, where they were talking about their own problems in, trying to find work, but then trying to understand the kind of technological conditions, doing that in a way where they will have, the fictioning then becomes, almost like a heuristic to kind of think through. Again, that might be a limited word if you understand the word heuristic in a limited way. I would say that I'm using it more in the way one first did it. To kind of, you always kind of discuss something in the context of something that you built. And, fictioning has enabled that. And I mean, I do this in different ways. At the moment, we are looking at this history of a complex set of buildings by an architect, a Sri Lankan architect, female architect. It's like a hugely contested topic. but like, how do we make this present, people engage this past by not just kind of giving them the narrative, but kind of creating like engaging different stories which become like games. So they create their own narratives, and in trying to create that, they understand some of the kind of causality and the ideas of time, like decisions that went behind the building. But these are all like different projects which have like very different content or issues. But I think what binds them is my interest in understanding them as, some way of introducing a metacommunicational kind of element to it, which then enables them to understand this kind of frictions in a different way. So
yeah, thanks so much, Domini. I would love to participate in your course, particularly as you bring Peter's Ministry of Fun into the next version of it, right? Yeah, so this brings us to the end of our 90 minutes together. Matthias, I want to thank Matthias for helping set this up and having it run very smoothly. Sometimes with Eventbrite, things don't always go that cleanly,
Yay.
but Matthias did a great job with this. And Paul, I don't know if you want to wrap up as the leader of the ASC speaker series or the president of ASC with some final word from you, but I really appreciate your having set this up.
Well, thank you. And thank you to everybody who was present, and to Domini particularly. You realize this was rescheduled 3 times. We were trying to get you for some time. The working group is going to meet shortly after this meeting, and we will be able to tell you what the next speaker will be shortly. Right now, we have a nice set of possibilities for the rest of the spring season, but we haven't yet scheduled who comes next. So that will be announced to you very shortly.
Okay,
Thank
so
you.
it's an invitation to stay tuned. And also, several people mentioned in the chat that they would like to have the slide deck. So I think maybe the best thing would be, Domini, I don't know if you want to put your email in the chat and people can send that to you directly rather than asking me for them. And then I wanted them also, but.
Domini, perhaps you can send it to me or Matthias, and we can make it available on the web when we put it up on the ASC site. That might be centralized and simpler for you.
I think
I can put a link with a video.
Yeah, I think we can do that, and that makes it better. And putting the link with the video sounds good. Yeah. Although for like understandable reasons, someone has said that you couldn't really see some of those images in for an example, the BCL map, but it is so intentionally because it's like in the copyrights, and there might be a book coming up in the future, and for that kind of quality of images, I think there is a level of copyright. So you would just see a kind of abstraction, but I think that would give you still some idea of the artifacts.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
so much.
Yeah, well, thanks everyone. And right, enjoy the rest of your Sunday, and Happy New Year to those I haven't said Happy New Year to yet this year. Thank you.
Thank